Okay, so we are going to deliberate. Hello, I am Professor Survajyoti Gupta. I'm a professor at OP Jindal Global University, and I'm also their director for Center for Alternative Dispute Resolution. So I have been, though my basic competence is in the court system, litigation, arbitration, exactly. So I have been applying myself for the past few days about the problem of fixing a legal liability on China. The topic that we are discussing today is the case against China. How can we take China to a court, right? How can we fix a legal liability on China as opposed to just say a moral or an ethical liability? Okay, so let's begin from the beginning only. You see, epidemics and diseases are acts of God, but there is always a visible hand of man involved. For example, the Black Death itself, which devastated around a third of the population of Europe, started when the Mongols started bombarding the city of Kaffa with plague infested cows, right? So it's not that it just started one day, it was started by someone, right? Similarly, the smallpox uh, epidemic in the North Americas apparently was started by colonists who gave the natives blankets infected with smallpox. So these are acts of deliberate infection. But even if you do not do it deliberately, you can sort of amplify a contagion through your acts of commission and omission. In the present coronavirus epidemic, the problem is this is exactly what the Chinese have done. Okay, so we are looking into as I said, we are looking into the liabilities of the human actors. We are looking into two actors primarily. One is the Chinese state, the other is the WHO. I mean, if any one of these actors have acted responsibly, this problem would not have escalated to the point it has done today. Okay, please remember something. When I say China, I mean the Chinese state and the Chinese Communist Party. I do not mean the Chinese people. Like, if there is some residual feeling of ill will towards the Chinese people because of this coronavirus, then I believe that is completely irrational. Racism at any point of time is deplorable, but at the time of pandemic, it's absolutely unacceptable. And furthermore, the Chinese people themselves actually are the primary and the first victims of the actions of the Chinese state. So they sort of they deserve our sympathy. They do not deserve to be scorned. Okay. So first, let me start with the name of the virus. I'm just addressing. It's not necessary, but I'm still addressing it. Why? Because I see a lot of material in the internet, some of which says something, some of which says something else. The name of the virus, like if we call it the Chinese virus, is it an act of racism? You see, viruses, like everything else, have a scientific name and a cultural name. Okay, things have the scientific name. We do not always address them by that. I mean, it would be ridiculous if every time you drink water you say I'm having H2O, or every time you see a cow I say, oh, that's a Bovis indica, right? It would be just absurd. Similarly, the scientific name of the virus is determined according to something called yes, the International Committee on Taxonomy of Viruses. So that committee has chosen to call it SARS-CoV-2, which stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2, because this is from a family of viruses known as SARS-CoV virus. Okay, one particularly nefarious and dangerous cousin of it is the SARS virus itself, which has also killed about 100,000 people worldwide by now. Okay, now this is the scientific name, fine. Thereafter, the Chinese at some point of time had chosen to call it novel coronavirus or nCoV-19. Okay, and this nomenclature was adopted by WHO on 11th of February in their communique. Why in COVID-19? Because the WHO has come up with something called the best practice guidelines in naming infectious disease 2015. The WHO's justification is that they call it COVID-19 because if you give it any other name, probably it might trigger some kind of prejudice towards the community, so on and so forth. So that's why the name. But this is, according to me, this is nonsense. The best practice of naming guidelines is not binding on anybody. It's not binding on states and certainly binding not on individual citizens of the state. And people who are calling it Wuhan virus, Wu flu, Chinese virus, are essentially calling attention to are calling out the Chinese state. They are not really having any prejudice towards the Chinese people. I mean, I of course would stick to the scientific name of the virus, but let me just point out that it's perfectly okay to call it Wuhan virus because that is where it came from. And I particularly like this name. It's called the CCP virus, which is the term often has been used by an Australian TV channel. This just shows that people are aware of the actions of the Chinese state and they're willing to point fingers, and whether they like it or not, they cannot hide behind the wall of racism, right? Anyways, what is inner name? Let us come to the most substantive aspects of it. Okay, so now we come to the question of legal liability. Okay, as I said, the question is not that of moral liability or ethical liability, but legal, as in something binding and some for something which there's a set of recourse available to a court or tribunal. So I would divide it into three parts. First is what is the liability of China. Then what is the substantive liability which we can affix on China? Then what is the liability of the World Health Organization? And third is the liability of the Chinese before the domestic courts, because I would also address there are a host of litigation which has been filed before American domestic courts and will probably be filed before domestic courts of other European countries as well. So I will address some of them as we go on. Okay. So you see, to take someone to the court, what we need is a set of legally enforceable norms, and thereafter we need a court that is responsible that can give the adequate relief. In domestic systems, it is easy because you have a coherent set of rules which runs across various things, and you have a hierarchy of courts that addresses it. So, for example, you have tax law, you have administrative law, you have criminal law, you have the law of civil procedure. You can always borrow ideas of administrative law into, say, interpretation of a tax statute, or you can use criminal sanctions for say delict pertaining to tax collection. Okay, so it is a comprehensive and cohesive system. Problem is international law is not like that. International law is the term that we often use. It's fragmentized. That is, it's broken up into several separate regimes. I have just made this very bad diagram. Yes, I hope you can see it. If you think of this material as as customary international law, you have this self-contained regimes like international humanitarian law, then international trade law, international environment law, all of them floating separately in that overall background of your international law. These regimes often do not interact with each other, right? And above all of these regimes there is the peremptory norms of international law. What are peremptory norms of international law? These are simply norms of international law that states consider, from which there can be no derogation. Okay, so these are like mandatory laws that is above any treaty commitment or any rule customary international law that might be out there. Okay, so it's like almost like the constitutional rules. Okay, the problem now is that if you have to bring China's conduct within a legal framework, you will have to take stuff from all these or several of these regimes and I have to knit them together. So, how to do that? So, there was this document by Professor Marty Koskanami. I mean, those of you who are interested in international law or you have studied international law almost have certainly studied it. So it is regarding this fragmentation of international law. So what Professor Kostanami had suggested is what we call systemic integration. Systemic integration is simply bring these regimes harmoniously in consonance with each other. So the legal mechanism that he had suggested is that we use Article 31.3 of the Vienna Convention of the Law of Treaties. Since almost 116 state parties have already signed it, including China, US, and India, so it's almost like universal application. So, what basically, I mean, it's very complicated to work it jurisprudentially, but long issue cut short, it's basically harmonious reading of it, right? So to bring China's conduct under the purview of an actionable claim, we have to basically read at least three regimes. One is the WHO Constitution and the IHR, which creates a sort of treaty-based claim. Secondly, you have to read international environmental law, like especially the principle of transboundary harm, which is not necessarily codified. I mean, part of it is, part of it isn't. And then you can also read the Biological Weapons Convention. I mean, the Biological Weapons Convention is something we are going to address, right? And all that, therefore, it requires, from the point of view of a lawyer, it requires us to be innovative. We have to do a lot of magajmari to sort of fix the liability on China. It's not that easy. Okay, so there is. It's not like say international trade law claim that you could invoke the WTO, or it's not some other claim that invoke an you have an arbitration tribunal, right? So you have to read them together, and then you have to make something out of it. Okay, so let's look at these regimes and where their conduct stand in the business, right? So first, uh, the WHO Constitution and the IHR. See, under the WHO Constitution, which there are like almost the entire membership of UN is party to it. You have Article 21 and Article 22, Article 21A and Article 22. So read together, these articles empower the World Health Assembly, which is basically assembly of the world's health minister, which is the guiding principle behind WHO, to adopt regulations to prevent international spread of diseases. And to that extent, who has adopted the international health regulations? There were earlier health regulations, but the present IHR goes back to 2005. And in fact, one of the reasons it came about is the SARS outbreak in China and China conduct during that period in 2003. Okay, so we are going to look into exactly how China is in violation of the principles of IHR. But before that, let me quickly point out to you some facts about epidemics in China in general. Okay, so China has been the incubator of viruses for past 100 years. Okay, so there are five large epidemics from China. I'll tell you. One is the Spanish flu, which was 1918-19. Then Asian flu, 1957-1958. Hong Kong flu, 1968-69. Swine flu, 2009-10. Okay, and there is also the SARS outbreak in 2003. So these outbreaks, why do they originate in China? There are some structural reasons why they originate in China. The Chinese people, like Indians, like their meat live slaughtered. Like you go and get your chicken slaughtered. That's exactly what the Chinese also do. But unlike us, the Chinese are in the habit of eating wild life, exotic animals like bats, pangolins, snakes, bear, Am I missing out something? Monkeys. Okay. And why they eat it? I mean, I think originally they got the habit since Mao's regime. There were famines in China, so people could eat whatever they had to, and now they eat it because the Chinese traditional practitioners have told them that it is that there is some health benefit. Like you and I, we would have apple cider vinegar, and a Chinese practitioner would say that something like a beer bile has similar health benefits. Okay, so this is a very prevalent practice in China. And these, so when you are in contact with such a large number of live animals, live wild animals, what happens? That there is a higher probability of a zoonotic virus, that is to say, a virus which has its origin in an animal, to cross over into human world. And this is exactly how all this uh, came about. Okay. Interestingly, they cause far less damage to China than they cause outside. There are several reasons, but mostly it is believed it's immunological reasons that the Chinese, since they live in such close proximity to the virus, have some immunity to flu kind of diseases, right? So Spanish flu had small casualties in China, but it had enormous casualties in the rest of the world, right? So there is a problem. The Chinese are aware of it. Okay, the Chinese are aware of these danger of virus contamination. They have strong state capacity. They have the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This is a leading body of virological research in the world. They have absolutely the world-class facilities. Then they have something known as pneumonia surveillance program, which basically looks into all this kind of respiratory kind of diseases, and vast amount of state resources and vast amount of state resources are directed towards, yeah, this China. Now, why am I pointing this out to you? And in fact, there was a paper as late as 2019 where the scientists from the Wuhan Institute of Virology had warned that there can be a bat, novel form of coronavirus passing over from bat. Because after, since 2003, they are also sort of invigilating the wild populations for any kind of viral contamination. So why I'm pointing out all this to you? Because from a legal point of view, China had foreseeability. So the Chinese state could know that there is a disaster that might strike at any point of time. It's not it had struck from the blue. Like when you live in Assam, you know that Brahmaputra can flood. Maybe in Kerala you would say, okay, once in a lifetime flood. But Brahmaputra floods every year, you know that. And if you fail to address that flood, obviously you had foreseeability, you failed in your duty, right? So China is like that. They knew that there is this virus danger is always there. It's a live threat. They didn't do anything. Anyways, let's see. Then what happens? So there's a publication in Lancet which suggested that the first coronavirus infection in China goes back to the 1st of December. So it goes back to early November. I am not able to verify that. I do not know, but you just note that there's a very prestigious journal which thinks it. But the timeline, uh, chronology समझिए पहले, right? The timeline that I have been able to figure out, the first infection is on 16th of December. This was, I believe, a shrimp trader of some kind who was in the Hunan seafood market in Wuhan city. That's the first. So he had been admitted to the hospital with flu-like syndromes, but seemed to be immune from flu medication. Right? His name, it seems, is Y Guixian. Then there's a lot of things. I'm just reading the major happenings. On 30th of December 2019, Wei Fen was the director of Wuhan Central Hospital, was treating these patients, and Dr. Li Wenlian shares a post in WeChat. WeChat is some kind of a Chinese WhatsApp. In a doctor's group, they share that this can be a kind of novel uterine virus, novel coronavirus. Now, what you have to note here is the response of the Chinese state. This director, who's a very high official, is part, I believe, is part of the party itself. was reprimanded. The other doctor was taken to Wuhan's Public Security Bureau. Remember, Wuhan Public Security Bureau is not your police station. When China calls somebody to a police station for questioning, that is a different level of fear that installs. Okay? So by next day, that is 31st of December 2019, there were 27 patients in the various hospitals, and China informed the World Health Organization about an unknown form of pneumonia. Now, this is interesting. The terminology unknown form of pneumonia has been used by China for SARS as well. By pneumonia, they mean not a disease caused by the pneumonia bacterium, but pneumonia-like syndromes, that is inflammation of lungs and all. Okay. Then they do something quite inexplicable. So there were a lot of samples that they collected from the bronchial fluid of these patients, which was there before various test centers in Hubei. Instead of sharing them, they destroy all these samples, and then they bring these doctors for questioning so and so. And before this Wuhan Public Security Bureau, it's a policy of threats and intimidation. Then the Chinese CCTV channel 13, this is a federal news channel, which issued an epidemiological alert that there is a virus out there, please be aware. Okay, interestingly, now they think that Wuhan virus is a racist term, but the Chinese TV was the one which was using it, okay, at that point of time. Anyways, another interesting aspect, another interesting event which happened on 31st is Taiwan apparently wrote an email to the WHO directory, and in that email they had Taiwan is not part of the WHO, by the way. Taiwan is an associate kind of membership, and then that was ignored by who? They had warned about human-to-human transferability, right? So in between, the Americans came to know the Chinese eliminated. The Chinese still could not identify the pathogen, but they were eliminating process of eliminating. So they found out it's not SARS, it's not influenza, it's not this, not that. No information was going to the WHO incidents management team, completely on the dark. Then on the 11th and the 12th, the Chinese did something quite unforgivable. So there were 400 healthcare providers who had come to Chinese, 400 patients, including healthcare workers who had been in the Chinese hospitals. Now, when you have healthcare of people, healthcare providers who are already infected, that simply shows that there is human transmission. I mean, that is almost a fail-safe way to know it. But still, the Chinese kept on saying that, oh no, we don't know. 14th of Jan, they informed WHO that we are not sure if it's human transmissible, and the WHO director tweeted it for the rest of the world. Okay, and on 13th of there was another patient who was found infected in Thailand, who had not at all gone to the seafood market. So all these are red flags that this is human transmissible, which they are ignoring or suppressing, whatever is their motto. Okay, then finally, by the way, on 9th, on 2nd itself, they had found the chromosome of the virus. They are studying the virus for a very long time, so they have good state capacity there. So they have sort of decoded the chromosome of the virus. So this gives you some idea about the capabilities of the virus, but it was also not shared with you. Then finally, on the 20th Jan, China accepted that the virus is capable of human transmission. By that time, there were several situations reported by WHO, but it did not issue public health emergency of international concern. So WHO has a mechanism called public health emergency of international concerns. That means something which basically think of it as a kind of WHO pandemic alert that was not issued even at this point of time. Okay, but what happened was 11th to 17th February, there was a Chinese Communist Party meet in Wuhan, and then there was the Chinese New Year Banquet. The Chinese New Year was going on at this point of time, and this is a major retail. It's a huge religious holiday for the Chinese, and it's a huge retail event, right? People buy a lot, sell a lot, goods for economy, and that was allowed to happen unhindered. So the Chinese, so thereafter on 22nd of Jan, there was a emerging a meeting of the WHO Emergency Committee, which basically sort of advises the Director General on pandemic, and that was apparently a split decision. The WHO could not decide. On 23rd, the Chinese put a lockdown on the entire city of Wuhan, which extended to the whole province of Hubei. Even at this point of time, who could not decide whether or not to issue a PHIC. The PHIC was issued only on the, yes, um, I think it was on 31st. Okay. Other countries by 23rd January, I mean, people have seen the writing on the wall and have started, including Singapore, including Chinese sort of satellites, Hong Kong and Macau had started imposing travel restriction. But who was keeping quiet? Who was like, okay. And then what ends up happening is that on 31st, after they have decided PHIC, United States imposed a travel ban. India, I think, did sometimes in early February, and who intermittently kept on opposing them. Oh, it's racist. Oh, it's that. It's that. It's that. Based on what? So two, three things we see that China is guilty of concealment. It's guilty of obstruction. Both of these run counter to Article 6 of the IHR, which says, which creates on all the states parties to assess all events that can constitute a public health emergency of international concern, which includes a pandemic, and inform who through its local focal point, right? This notification is not just call them up and give them the info. This notification involves application of mind. This notification has to be done in accordance to a decision instrument given in Annexure 2. And one of the ways you have to decide, one of the information you have to give is possibility of human transmission, and the test for that is basically whether healthcare professionals are getting infected, because then it's 100% human transmissible, right? This not a one-time duty. Under Article 6.2 of the IHR, this is a continuing duty, and the China has to give continuous reports, share the medical data, share the samples with the WHO, which is there in Article 6.2. This also doesn't happen. So now there, then what happens? Yes, and remember Article 6 and Article 7. I mean, even without a public health emergency, you will have to inform all unusual public health events to the WHO under Article 7. And this has to be read with Article 42 of the IHR. Article 42 of the IHR says that health measures initiated and completed without delay, so and so, has to be done in a transparent and non-discriminatory manner. Right? Not only you will do it, but there is a express requirement of transparency, which is not followed, obviously. Then, of course, you are treated in terms of the Vienna Convention of the Law of Treaties, and Vienna Convention of the Law of Treaties, Article 18, requires you to read all treaties in consonance with the objectives of the treaty. If the objective of the IHR is to basically prevent the spread of pandemic, then all these actions run completely counter to it. Okay. Now, now we have to address something. Like to set a liability, you will also always have to consider if there's a causation. That is it the delict which caused the damage or the injury, right? A causal chain, as we call in law. After all, I mean, the Chinese and various other people have pointed out that even if China is in the wrong, the others are not in the right. I mean, Donald Trump himself had various warnings about this, and he ignored it, right? And various Western leaders are also sort of took the virus lightly in the beginning. China is not responsible for all the wrongs done by the Western or other leaders. But China is liable for the wrongs done by itself. Okay. So, what is the causal line causation we would draw? I would put it this way: the first cause of action arose between 31st 12 when China informed of an unknown form of pneumonia. Even at this point of time, they had probably the information that this is human transmissible and the nature of the virus. Okay. Second, the cause of action rose between 9, 11th, and 14th of Jan when China misled about human transmissibility of this virus. Okay. And of course, China is also in violation of its liabilities under Article 6.2 because it continues to be very opaque about information pertaining to the virus. Okay. Now, the exact causation line you will have to establish with reference to your expert testimony, but you would uh, what I can see prima facie is that that China has basically delayed the world by around 2 weeks. Like if you take the time between the knowledge of the human transmissibility and the declaration of PHIC, there's a distance of around 2 weeks. When after PHIC is declared, I mean all the nations of the world has been put on notice, and so thereafter China could not have done anything. Right, that point taken. Right. So how dangerous was this delay? So I would draw your attention to a study by University of Southampton, which shows that a non-pharmaceutical intervention, that is social distancing, isolation, travel ban, so and so, if it was conducted 1 week, 2 week, or 3 weeks earlier, then the rate of infection could have been reduced by 66%, 86%, and 95% respectively. So, in that light, China has taken from the world precious 2 weeks through these words, to these acts of omission and commission. Now, then the first question that will now have to be asked is, why did this happen? I mean, why did China misinform the world? To understand this, one basic characteristics of all dictatorial governments, that they kill people through their casual negligence. It's not that there was a very, I mean, somebody had a plan. It's just that they are so callous. You can I don't know how many of you have seen this HBO miniseries called Chernobyl, right? So Chernobyl, they were doing a perfectly legitimate experiment, but they were doing it wrong, and then something happened, and then they hit the fact, and then they sort of killed people, and they heroically buried them and gave them medals for that act. So this is the same thing. It has happened. The best I can understand from China's reaction is that the local party in Wuhan and Hubei was trying to protect the CCP meet between 11th to 17th of Jan and the Chinese New Year at that point of time. It was necessary for the economic point of view, and they thought they can just hoodwink the virus. It's just that the virus proved much stronger than they thought it would be. The virus proved too much of them. So this is the most benevolent interpretation I find of that action. Thereafter, they are still withholding data. Why they are withholding it? Probably to get some kind of geopolitical advantage. Like if you have better data, you will arrive at a vaccine first. You will arrive at a medication first, and therefore you can establish your dominance. I mean, where will people go? They will have to come to you. Okay, so this is actually the most benevolent interpretation I find. People have not been this kind to China. So there's another theory going on in social media right now, which is supported by this French Nobel laureate Luc Montaigne, which says that this novel coronavirus is actually a man-made virus. It was created because the Chinese were trying to find some kind of vaccine for AIDS, and then it somehow got leaked from Wuhan virology lab, came to China, then so and so happened. Well, I'm not a scientist, so I do not really have an idea about this. But what I can tell you that generally speaking, world scientific community does not seem to agree. I mean, the general scientific consensus is that it is a natural virus. It's just that a natural virus with human culpability has assumed an enormous proportion. Okay. In any case, remember, it's not necessary for a legal point of view to ascribe an intention on China. Because what we are talking about is what we call legal malafide or malice in law. Malice in law means that, yeah, it is an act done wrongfully without a reasonable cause. Okay, so it doesn't have to be a wrong intention in their mind. It's simply that it was done wrongfully. Okay, so China can be accused of that. But then again, see, IHR and who constitution, best of my understanding, would have a diligence standard, right? That I am supposed to do things this way. I did not do it. IHR is also not equipped with a set of sanctions. Why? Because IHR, I mean, what can happen if you build a purely IHR based case? They can say, well, there were some small irregularities here and there. Things happened. It was, the local party that did the wrong. Punished them, fired them, and we have also suffered. Look, we are the victims. And IHR, as I said, it doesn't have sanction. Why? Because IHR is like IHR is based on the principle of good faith, and it is also based on the assumption that everybody wants not to have an epidemic, right? It's like you are giving some drowning person, throwing some drowning person a rope. Will you also make it criminally that person criminally liable if he does not take the rope? It will automatically take the rope, right? To that extent, IHR is expected to be self-executing, but that doesn't happen, right? So therefore, we need to find something stronger than the IHR, and this is where the international environmental law regime comes in. Okay, so just refer back to what I was telling to you that you have to basically cross fertilize various legal regimes. I mean, there is not one regime under which you will give the one remedy you are looking for, right? So, yes, so of immediate application would be the principle of transboundary harm. Originally, this principle was set out in the trail smelter arbitration sometimes in the late 20s between US and Canada. So it requires the states to refrain from using that territory for activities that might cause harm internationally. So that's the rule. So we also have ILC draft articles on prevention of transboundary harm. So there's this whole regime for that. Now, this principle originally applied to just physical pollutants, like, say, for example, smoke or noxious gases or particulate pollution, so on and so forth. Okay, but the ICJ in the nuclear weapons case, legality of nuclear weapons, 1996, this was extended to encompass any threat that endangers the living space or quality of life and health of human beings. So, in that case, of course, the pollutant was nuclear radiation, right? But if it applies to nuclear radiation, we can arguably use it for a virus. So we have to basically expand this principle through analogy. Okay. Now, why would you want to hold? Why would you want to use? As I said, IHR is not sufficient because of its nature. Environmental law paradigm allows for a much greater flexibility and holding the state parties to account. Only thing that it has to require a human causation. That is to say, that harm has to be caused by something done by humans. So, human causation can mean an act, but it can also mean an omission, right? Like if you pull the genie out of the box versus you just kept the box with the lid open, is there a difference in the two? Okay. So, IHA, international environmental law, creates deeper liabilities. Yeah. The framework for transboundary harm also arguably incorporates the principle of strict liability. So the IHR would have a principle of what you can call diligence standard, that you have to follow diligence. But transboundary harm, especially when you are talking about ultra hazardous things, arguably requires you to follow strict liability. Strict liability is no fault liability. That you don't have to show a fault of the state parties. It's just puts the onus back on the party to show that they could not have prevented it, right? So there are judice. So this is just an arguable point. I mean, even the principle of transboundary harm is in a process of evaluation. It's not there yet totally. Then bringing it in the ambit of transboundary harm will also allow the usage of other environmental law principles, especially the principle of precautionary principle. A precautionary principle, if any of you are aware of your um, environmental law, you would know that precautionary principle means that lack of scientific certainty should not be a ground of postponing measures causing environmental damage. If we apply this to release of a virus, we can say that even when China was not sure about the human transmissibility of the virus, looking into the dangerous nature and the ultra hazardous nature of the virus, they should have taken measures, containment measures much earlier. And this also goes for WHO as well. Okay. So this would be the line of argument. Finally, if you go environmental law mode, you can use address the issues of structural issues. For example, you can target China's wildlife trade. Why do they have this wildlife trade? Because they have enabling legislation. Their Wildlife Act treats wildlife as a natural resource and encourages its use by the citizens. And this is why they have such large scale industrial wildlife industry, which amplifies the danger of virus and which has led to the situation we're today. So even those kind of things can be addressed better under your environmental law regime. Now, another regime. So that's our. This, of course, you understand, are just ballpark discussions. I mean, if you have to make a real case in a real court, you'll have to work more than that. I'm just giving you an outline of how it will be done. Then another regime we can discuss is the regime of arms control, especially the Convention on Prohibition of Development, Production, Stockpiling of Bacteriological and Toxic Weapons, of long name, shortly called the Bioweapons Convention. Right. Most of the lawsuits that have filed in the domestic courts of US have always gone under this convention. Why? The basic reason I can find out is that they just wanted to say that China has created a bioweapon. Now, this bioweapon theory, which is just a stronger version of what we discussed earlier, that this is a man-made virus accidentally made so and so. I mean, there is little support of it in the scientific community. There is one article which is submitted by one Xiao Botato, who is a Chinese professor, that this is man-made. But the American public officials have just lapped it up. So this has been supported by this Republican Senator Tom Cotton. Mike Pompeo, who is the U.S. Secretary of State, is arguing that this coronavirus, there has to be an investigation into origins. So all the American lawmakers want that. Now the problem with this, I tell you, that this argument does not seem to enjoy a wide enough support among the scientific community, right? Whether or not this is true, that this is a bioweapon or not, I mean, the only way to prove some facts is through your scientific evidence, and how a scientific evidence is accepted in a court is through your Fry test or Daubert test that requires general acceptance by the scientific community. So, that being the case, if the Western scientists themselves are not convinced of it, they're unlikely to be able to prove this to a court. There is a offshoot of that. I mean, a slightly toned down argument which says that maybe Non-reporting of microbial or biological weapons can itself constitute a crime and constitute a delict under the convention. So this is also a speculative argument which some has taken. We'll have to see where it goes. But speaking for myself, I am not very convinced of the biological weapons argument. Right? You don't actually need to have the argument. So these are of course the substantive obligations. Now you look into the rules of attribution. The rules of attribution comes in international law under your like the draft articles of state responsibility. So it can be attributed all internationally wrongful act of a state entails international responsibility of the state. Article 1 of the draft principles itself, draft principles being reflection of the customary international law. Also, conduct of any organ of the state is attributable to the state. So, regardless of who in China did this, whether it's the Hubei party, it's the Wuhan party, it's Xi Jinping himself, or some doctor somewhere, it is in the end going to be reflected on the Chinese state as per international understanding of it. Another interesting aspect, I'll just pick your brains if you think that would work. The Chinese Communist Party. Generally speaking, a party like say the Congress Party or the BJP party is just a private association of individuals, right? But the CCP, because of its unique nature within the Chinese state, is also a state organ. So the wrongdoings by the CCP is going to be reflected on the Chinese state, and the CCP in turn is responsible for the conduct of China. So when we bring this suits, we can possibly make even the Communist Party a party to the suit. Okay. Now the question that comes in: where do we go? Which tribunal we apply to? Now remember, there is nothing preventing you from enforcing international obligation in a domestic court. I mean, there's no theoretical difficulty. There's only one practical difficulty in that, and that is the principle of foreign sovereign immunity. A foreign sovereign immunity says that a sovereign of another country cannot be sued in the domestic courts of my country. That in turn is based on the principle of comity, on respect for international law, so and so, so and so. But that is a rule of your private international law. That is to say, the sovereign immunity in India comes from the CPC. Sovereign immunity in US comes from the FISA, that is Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. So these are statutes. If it is statute, you can always change the law, right? You can always withdraw that sovereign immunity. However, to what extent is international obligations reflected in your law? I just tell you it very short that all rules of customary international law are part of your domestic law. However, your treaty commitments to become part of your law, usually there has to be an enabling legislation by the parliament. Okay, so that being the case, so just hold the thought that domestic courts are just as good. We can approach the domestic courts. But before that, let us first look into the international courts, because you see, it's always more satisfactory to bring a state before an international court, because that sort of has a much higher degree of legitimacy. If we sue China in our domestic courts and there is a decree, China would always say it's your thing. I mean, the court was biased. I have no respect for your court, your state, doesn't matter. Right. So our first impulse should be to approach the international forums, international courts and tribunals. Now there are a lot of scholarly articles that are going on. I'm sure you have seen some of them. So I would just reproduce the basic arguments. I mean, that doesn't really. I mean, this is not really which requires a lot of innovation. It's just pure jurisdictional question, and this is actually an easy part, right? It might look like a lot of nitpicking here and there, but I believe cases like this, jurisdiction would be established. Anyways, just have a short look. Bear with me for a moment. Have a short look at the rules. So IHR itself has a dispute settlement mechanism. This is in Article 56 of the IHR. This allows resolution of interstate disputes pertaining to the IHR through conciliation, mediation, and good offices of the Director General. Now the problem here is, of course, All these are consensual processes. Even arbitration requires two parties to submit themselves to the arbitration, right? China is highly unlikely to agree to any arbitration like that. China has refused to accept arbitration in South China Sea, which could have solved lots of problems. We have solved our delimitation of sea maritime boundaries with Bangladesh through arbitration. China hasn't. It's not a country that believes in arbitration. So anything which is consensual, you can count them out. Then what you have Article 75 of the WHO Constitution. Now, Article 75 of the WHO Constitution confer ICJ jurisdiction in the interpretation of the WHO Constitution, which includes the IHR, I suppose. Then the problem is that it requires negotiation and discussion before the World Health Assembly first. Now, this is a technical problem, but generally, how ICJ tends to see this, like there is this case ICJ's decision in Ukraine versus Russia, where they just said so long as the parties have tried to negotiate in good faith, this is not a bar to jurisdiction. This is not a bar to compulsory jurisdiction. So I believe that ICJ can be made to, if you can find somebody with a stout enough heart to take China to the court, this is not going to be a problem. Okay. So once, of course, ICJ accepts jurisdiction, it can give the relief against China, and that relief has to be can be enforceable. There is a stale there. I will just come back to it. The other option is to invoke the advisory jurisdiction of the ICJ. So, under Article 65 of the Statute of the ICJ, UN organizations, including WHO, can send some question to ICJ for a legal opinion. That is not binding. However, that sets the law, right? So, because um, many legal scholars understand that it is difficult for anybody to actually aggressively challenge China to the court. Maybe US can do it, maybe India can do it, maybe Europe would do it, but none have done it so far. Suppose they do it, suppose they don't. So better option is to, to have more legitimacy, to avoid this kind of international hostility. You can just ask a advisory opinion to the ICJ. Maybe the WHO can be persuaded. The problem is the WHO to seek advisory opinion would require permission of the General Assembly, and China is probably going to block it there. Okay, so there is a problem there as well. Now the question is, what will it achieve? So we see that there are rights, and then there is a method or by which we can give remedy. So EB just EB remedium, we go to court, we get a degree, right? Or is it? I'm not so sure. Because to prove this case against China, a lot of it is already in media, and Chinese cannot sort of purge them off the media, and that has to be, the onus would be on China to disprove that things did not work like that. But a lot of it is also based on estimates, guesses. You have to prove it before a court of law through evidence, right? And you need people to give deposition. So what you probably have to do is somebody has to use their intelligence resources to pull people out of China and to pull documents out of China. This is much tougher than you think it is. It is not as easy as going to the court. Okay. So I can just give you an example of what happens when you sue a superpower. I believe all of you have heard this case in your law school. It is called the case of Nicaragua versus US, in which the United States was held responsible for fomenting insurrection in Nicaragua. The US did not participate in the case after it lost the jurisdiction point. And when the order came against the US, it blocked it in the Security Council. And the statement given by Jean Kirkpatrick, who was the US envoy to UN at that point of time, it simply described the ICJ as a semi-legal, semi-political body whose judgments are sometimes obeyed, sometimes not. That is to say, ICJ judgments are not to be taken very seriously. So if this was the attitude of the US, this is precisely going to be the attitude of China as well. Okay. But however, there is a big difference between US and China here. The US, they may have disliked the proceedings and they might have showed contempt for the proceedings, but they did not physically block the proceedings. So there were Americans like Dr. David McMichael, Professor Michael Glennon, Father Jean Johnson, all Westerners who went before the ICJ and gave deposition. Will you find a Chinese doctor, Chinese expert, Chinese virologist to do so? No. Chinese, I mean, the people who could, they're now disappearing, kind of. Okay, so to do this against China is going to be very challenging, to say the least. Now, short, I just address whose liability in a very short. The who structure, as you know, is something like this. At the top, you have the World Health Assembly, which is a collection of health ministers. Then you have the Director General, who is being supervised by an executive body, also chosen from the Health Assembly. And under the director, there is the Secretariat of WHO that controls the professionals. Okay, and then there is emergency committee under the Director General who advises him on the pandemics. Now, the present Director General of WHO, his name is Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. I call him Dr. Tedros. He is a China-backed nominee. He is from Ethiopia, which is has almost like Pakistan acquired the status of basically a Chinese colony, right? We are going to, for our sake, consider that all this doesn't matter, and he's a strictly non-interested person. Even then, what is the nature of duty of the DG? The Director General has to decide whether an event in public health emergency of international concern under the IHR. How will he decide? Based on information with the state party, advice of emergency committee, scientific principles, and assessment to human life. All this in Article 12 of the IHR. So if you look into it, it's very clear. The DG, when it comes to public health emergency, is not a postman. He does not just convey information given to him by the state party. He has to apply his mind. Was there an application of the mind? No. Right? On prima facie, he seems to have disregarded the email from Taiwan. He did not ask China for the samples or any of the information. Remember, all the other disease control agencies like CDC, India's own ICMR, they are all embedded in WHO. The WHO director can access their help if he wishes to. Did he do that? No. Instead of doing all this, he did not even call the meeting for the emergency committee. The emergency committee came on 22nd Jan, when on 23rd they locked down Wuhan, so it has reached quite a severe situation by then. Why that delay? Did he not understand? China is a country which has a prior record of doing this, of concealing information. As I told you, the IHR itself came because of the Chinese acts of commission and omission during the SARS epidemic. So did he not know this? Of course he did. Right. Either China was stolen, either he was just being fooled, or he is in derogation of his duties of public trust as international public servant. Okay, he did not make any independent assessment of the matter. Then, if he believed, now his supporters are now all over the social media, they are arguing that he was being extra nice to China because he wanted to, get their support. He wanted to get their cooperation. I just point out to the actions of his predecessor, not predecessor, but much earlier predecessor. Her name was Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was a former Prime Minister of Norway, a very illustrious international public servant, was the WHO Director General in 2003. She had called out China from day one for their lack of cooperation. She had mobilized the international community, and she had exercised her duty of independent assessment of the matter, which this individual did not do. This is personal opinion. Our government probably doesn't share this. I think this man should just step down. If who has to have any credibility left, he has done enough already, right? He is making it even harder because Chinese are destroying evidence, and he's just keeping quiet. And he's even now going on supporting China. He tried to put the Chinese cruel lockdown that they put on Wuhan, which violates every WHO norms and quarantine. He tried to put that as some kind of a example for Europeans to follow, right? So this person, anyways, this is a sad betrayal of public trust. By the way, who, as an international public body, have an international legal personality? So, if somebody is filing a case against China, who should probably be a necessary party in that suit? Should explain its stance, that why it did the things that it did. Okay. Now, this brings us back to the litigation in the national courts. Now, as I said, nothing prevents the enforcement of international claims in domestic courts, right? Except sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity is something part of your private international law. It is not part of public international law. It can be statutorily removed. In fact, the Americans are trying to do precisely that. They are trying to get the FISA, the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act, amended. And there is this person, Republican, Josh Hawley. He is, of course, establishment guy. He's supported by Mike Pompeo and all the elders in the Republican Party. They wish to get this FISA amended to bring civil suits against China by American citizens. Okay, already certain suits have been filed. So there's a spate of lawsuits in American courts. China is sued by the US state of Missouri. Then there's a class action lawsuit in Florida. In UK, the Henry Jackson Society is actually seeking global support for suing China. Right, so efforts are on. Now these lawsuits would face the same problems of evidence and this and that, right? And suppose they culminate into decree. So how do you satisfy the decree? The basic problem is that the Chinese state does not as such have a lot of assets outside China. I mean, the Chinese companies, of course, have massive assets, but the Chinese state doesn't, right? So how do you enforce this decree? So there are a couple of ways you can do it. Okay. Now this lawsuits actually is a part of a wider American effort at a lawfare at China. A lawfare basically means you use your domestic court system to get some kind of geopolitical advantage, right? The Americans are doing this with reference to their Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and now will be doing this with reference to coronavirus. Now, what would happen? Assets. Okay, so Chinese assets could be assets of state-owned Chinese company. I mean, you can probably extend it that way, provided you show that it's held by the. I mean, you can show ownership, you can show the connection. Another aspect I think Americans are going to exploit is the opaque nature, is the structure of the Chinese companies. Like in India, you have a public company which is owned by the state, 51% ownership, or you have a private company. The private person can be close to government, can be absolutely his lapdog, but he is a separate legal entity. I mean, there is no merger of the entity of the state and the private corporation, right? So there's arm's length relationship. China, that is not like that. I mean, this is the problem that they have faced with Hui. Hui is essentially owned by a private person, a promoter-based company. But then again, the company is owned at various places by entities which are linked to either the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese state. So all large Chinese corporations are in that way beneficially owned by the Chinese state and the Chinese Communist Party, right? So if the United States district courts want, they can exploit these chink in the armor. This is of course going to lead to a huge escalation between US and China, because then you are targeting somebody's property. I mean, already there is a trade war that's won. This is going to be a trade world war now, if that is what they're doing. The Americans, I mean, this suits might sometimes look at you as madcap, but they are not madcap at all. I mean, they are abusive at some point of time. They can You can consider them that way, but they are not mad. There is a thinking behind them. Okay, so the Americans are also probably hoping for the coming into effect of the Hague Judgments Convention, which would allow foreign judgments to be enforced in different countries. If that happens, they can use these decrees in their domestic court to target Chinese entities, including Chinese entities connected to the BRI, that is the Belt and the Road Initiative. This would be a very interesting. I mean, as a dispute resolution professor, I find it extremely interesting because I see a lot of potential. Is I mean, you can take it really far. The pandemic has shattered the US economy. It has shattered our economy as well, but the damage done to US is much greater. The number of people who are dead, the crisis that has been created, the dissonance in the political system that the virus has created is going to be much greater for US than it's for any other country actually. And European countries like Italy and UK, they have just been knocked off their feet. Okay, this, however, also gives them the opportunity to get back at China, and they are unlikely to give it up. As I said, that though you can set up a very good case in international law, international courts may not be in the end able to give you justice, so that they might try to achieve through domestic court system, right? Now, this is of course about the court system. Then there are conduct of the Chinese, which I do not see how can make them liable. Like for example, disinformation campaign that they have run. They actually tried to show that this is some bioweapon created by US. Remember, this is not some Breitbart news shouting at the top of their voice. This is the Chinese Communist Party officials, Chinese state officials, who went and gave this kind of statements. Right? They are blocking world's medical supplies, the disruption in supply chain with a very clear intention to get a market leverage. They had opposed the travel bans, which probably made it much worse for countries like Pakistan and Philippines. Okay, they have cruelly excluded who from Taiwan from the World Health Organization. If Taiwan was there as a party, probably they could have given better information, which information was not available now. So these are really not. I mean, correct me if wrong. I wait for your inputs, but these are not really legally acceptable claims. But these show the character of the regime. Okay, when the going gets tough, your real face comes out, right? Now, China, according to me, follows what is you can best call the Gabbar Singh principle. A Gabbar Singh principle is the opposite of the Spider-Man principle. The Spider-Man principle says that if you have great power, that like great responsibility comes with great power. The Gabbar Singh principle, on the other hand, says with great power comes immunity from any responsibility. Right? There is a need to hold this country to account now, not because what they have already done, but what this regime is going to do next. If they get away with this without a scratch on them, they are not going to stop them. I mean, I just shudder to think what else they will do, right? So I'll just open for questions now. Let me know if you have any thoughts or questions on the matter. Thank you. Okay, so I think there's no immediate question that you have. So What I'll do is then I'll log off, but I am also giving you my ID. Anybody who wishes to get in contact with me. So let me know your thoughts on that. The student community should be at the forefront of the endeavors, and let us really jam our heads as to what we can do. I mean, how we can bring this country to hold this country accountable. I mean, cannot let people get away with this. Okay. Okay, so I have shared with you my email ID. So if you have any question, if you would like to react, you would like to give me some ideas, please let me have your thoughts. Okay, so thank you for being with me. See you later. Bye. Okay, there is a question. When it comes to domestic courts, can the actions of America with regards to recovery from Saudi Arabia for the 9/11 bombing be used to allow recovery from China? Yes, it can be. I mean, that is the hope. But however, remember, China is not Saudi Arabia. Why? Saudi Arabia have a thing called sovereign fund, which is heavily invested there, and the China and the Saudi royals are also heavily invested there. Having said that, you cannot the exact case laws for that, but yes, it does set up a template, and this is what the American lawyers are sort of counting on. Okay, as I said, this is quite unprecedented. It's not something we know or we have come across, and we don't really have a template here. Okay, so we'll have to see where it goes. I mean, it requires innovation from our point of view. It would require a lot of intellectual effort on our part. We have to apply things, we have to extend things by analogy, we have to use precedents creatively, and that's how it can work. Okay. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Please reach out to me if you wish, if you have any questions or any comments. Thank you.